Before the United States ever existed, before there was a flag or a constitution, there was land, endless, silent, and beautiful. From the icy mountains of Alaska to the golden deserts of Arizona, this vast continent was home to countless peoples, the Native Americans. They lived not with greed, but with balance. They hunted, they sang, they prayed to rivers and stars. For thousands of years, they called this place home, long before anyone called it America. In the stillness of the forests and the whispers of the wind, stories were born. Stories of spirits, animals, creation, and love. Life was not about owning, but belonging. The land, the sky, the rivers, they were not possessions, but family. Then, one day, the sea brought strangers. In 1492, a sailor named Christopher Columbus sailed across the vast Atlantic Ocean, believing he had found a new route to India. He had not. He had found a new world, or at least what Europeans believed was new. To the people already living here, it was not new. It was sacred, ancient, and alive. Soon after Columbus, more ships came from Spain, from France, from England. They carried explorers, priests, soldiers, and dreams of gold and glory. And with them came something else: disease, greed, and sorrow. Millions of native lives were lost, not in battle, but in silence to invisible enemies carried across the sea. By the early 1600s, European powers began building small settlements. Jamestown, founded in 1607, became the first permanent English colony. 13 years later, a group known as the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth, seeking religious freedom. They were strangers in a strange land, cold, hungry, and afraid. But they survived, with help from the same native peoples whose world was fading. The colonies grew, 13 in total, stretching along the eastern coast. Men and women worked hard, planting tobacco, cotton, and hope. They built towns, schools, and churches. Yet they also built walls of inequality between races, between masters and servants, between the free and the enslaved. By the mid-1700s, tension was rising. The colonies were under British rule, and the king demanded taxes, heavy and endless. No taxation without representation, the people cried. In 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. It was the birth cry of a new nation. Ordinary farmers and blacksmiths picked up muskets and fought for an idea: liberty. In 1776, brave men gathered in Philadelphia. They wrote words that would echo through centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence was more than ink on paper. It was a spark, a promise to humanity. The war was long and bitter, but against the most powerful empire in the world, the colonies stood together. In 1783, the British finally surrendered. Freedom had been won, but peace would take time to learn. The United States of America was young, fragile, hopeful, uncertain. George Washington, the man who had led armies through snow and blood, became its first president. He refused to be called king. He simply wanted to serve. The Constitution was written in 1787, a document built on compromise and courage. It spoke of liberty and justice, of checks and balances, of dreams that would guide generations. But in the spaces between its words, a silence remained, the silence of those still enslaved. The new republic promised freedom, but not for all, and that quiet contradiction would grow louder with time. As years passed, America began to expand westward. Pioneers rode in wagons across endless plains, searching for land and life. They followed trails like the Oregon Trail, crossing rivers, deserts, and mountains. To them, it was destiny. Manifest destiny, they called it. The belief that America was meant to stretch from ocean to ocean. But for native tribes, it was the end of their world. Wars were fought, treaties were broken, lands were taken. The frontier became both a dream and a wound, a symbol of growth and loss, of hope and heartbreak. By the early 1800s, machines began to change everything. Steam engines roared, factories hummed, and trains stretched across the land like iron snakes. Cities rose. Smoke filled the sky. People left farms for factories. The rhythm of life quickened, faster, louder, harsher. Yet beneath all the progress, poverty and inequality grew. Children worked in mills, and immigrants struggled to survive in crowded cities. Still, the dream of America, of opportunity, kept hearts alive. For every tear, there was a song. For every fall, a rise. But one shadow darkened every sunrise: slavery. Millions of Africans had been brought to America in chains. They built the fields, the houses, the wealth of the nation, but lived as property. They were bought and sold like cattle. Families were torn apart, names erased, hope crushed. Yet, in their songs, in the soft hum of their pain, lived something unbreakable: spirit. They sang of freedom. They dreamed of light. And slowly, voices began to rise across the nation. Voices that said, "This cannot stand." By 1861, the United States was divided, North against South. At the heart of the conflict was slavery, but also pride, economy, and power. The South wanted independence to preserve its way of life. The North wanted unity to preserve the Union. For 4 terrible years, the land bled. Brother fought against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Fields once full of crops became graveyards. Abraham Lincoln, calm yet burdened, led the nation through its darkest hours. He spoke not of vengeance, but of healing. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." In 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in the rebellious states. It was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of freedom. 2 years later, in 1865, the Civil War ended. The Union was saved. Slavery was abolished. But the cost was beyond measure: over 600,000 lives lost. The land was silent once again, and in that silence, a wounded nation began to rebuild. The Civil War was over, but the wounds remained deep. Cities were in ruins, families were shattered, and a nation stood staring at itself in silence. The year was 1865. The air still smelled of smoke, and the soil still drank the memory of blood. Now came the hardest part, healing. They called it reconstruction. The South had to be rebuilt, not just with bricks, but with hearts. Freed men and women, once slaves, now walked the land as citizens. But freedom was fragile. They searched for work, for dignity, for a place in a world that had never accepted them as equals. Schools were built, laws were written, and for a brief, shining moment, hope began to grow again. But old hatreds die slowly. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose from the ashes of defeat, spreading terror through the night. And soon, new laws, Jim Crow laws, divided the land once more. Freedom had been promised, but equality was still a dream. As the 1800s drew to a close, America began to change once again. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Iron became steel. Steam became power. Cities rose higher, their skylines reaching for the heavens. Trains thundered across the land, stitching east and west together. Factories roared, and immigrant workers from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and China poured into the cities. They came chasing a dream, the American dream. But dreams came with a cost. Children worked 12 hours a day in dark mills. The rich grew richer, the poor poorer. Smoke filled the skies of Pittsburgh and Chicago, turning day into dusk. Still, the nation moved forward. Electric lights began to glow. Telephones carried voices across miles, and in the hum of machines, America began to reinvent itself as a modern power, restless and ambitious. The late 1800s were called the Gilded Age, golden on the surface but cracked beneath. Wealth glittered in New York mansions, while hunger grew in city slums. Men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan became legends of industry, their fortunes towering over the nation. But behind every empire stood thousands of tired, invisible hands, workers, laborers, immigrants, who built a world they could barely afford to live in. New movements rose, labor unions, women's suffrage, the call for fairness and justice. Voices that had been silent for centuries began to speak. It was the whisper of change, soft but unstoppable. The 1900s dawned with energy and optimism. Cities sparkled with electric light. Cars began to roll on dusty roads. Airplanes lifted human dreams into the sky. But the world beyond America was changing too. Old empires trembled, new powers rose, and far across the ocean, in Europe, a storm was gathering. In 1914, the First World War began. For 3 long years, America watched from afar, until 1917, when it could no longer remain silent. American soldiers, young and afraid, crossed the Atlantic to fight in muddy trenches of France. They fought not for conquest, but for peace, for the hope that this war would end all wars. In 1918, the guns fell silent. The war was over, but the cost was heavy. The world was forever changed. The decade that followed was wild and bright. Jazz filled the air. Radios carried music and laughter into every home. Cities danced. Skyscrapers rose. Automobiles roared through the streets. Women cut their hair short and claimed their independence. Writers, painters, and musicians turned rebellion into art. It was the age of motion, of energy, of youth. But beneath the glitter, the ground was cracking. Money flowed fast, but it was fragile, built on dreams, not stability. And in 1929, the music stopped. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Millions lost their jobs, their homes, their hope. The Great Depression had begun. The 1930s were years of hunger and struggle. Men stood in bread lines, waiting for a meal. Children went to bed hungry. Families packed their lives into wagons and searched for work across dust-covered plains. Farmers lost their land to drought. The Dust Bowl turned green fields into deserts. In cities, the sound of machines went silent. Yet, even in despair, the human spirit endured. Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1932, brought a message of hope. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. His New Deal programs built roads, bridges, and dreams again. Slowly, painfully, the country began to heal. But peace never lasts long in history. And across the ocean, another storm was rising, darker than before. In 1939, war erupted again. Germany invaded Poland, and soon the world was at war. At first, America watched, cautious, distant. But on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The next day, America declared war. The sleeping giant had awakened. Factories turned from making cars to making tanks. Men went to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. Women filled the factories, the offices, the hospitals. The nation stood as one. The war was brutal. Millions died. Cities burned. But hope survived. In 1945, the war ended. Nazi Germany was defeated. And for the first time, atomic fire touched the world in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. America stood victorious, but also burdened with the power to destroy. The modern world had begun. After World War II, peace came, but it was uneasy. The United States and the Soviet Union became two giants locked in a silent struggle, the Cold War. It was not fought with guns, but with fear, spies, and ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus control. Wars were fought through others, in Korea, in Vietnam. Rockets reached the stars. Satellites watched from the heavens. The race for space became a symbol of human ambition and rivalry. At home, Americans built suburban lives, small houses, white fences, television dreams. But under the comfort, there was tension, racial injustice, nuclear fear, political unrest. The world balanced on a knife's edge between peace and annihilation. In the 1950s and 60s, the long cry for equality finally rose to a roar. Black Americans, tired of centuries of injustice, began to march, to speak, to demand their rights. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. preached peace and power through love. His words echoed like music. I have a dream of a nation where color no longer divided, where freedom truly meant freedom for all. It was not easy. Protests met violence. Marchers were beaten, jailed, and killed. But the movement could not be silenced. Civil rights acts were passed. Segregation began to crumble. And though the road was long, the dream had begun to take root. The 1970s brought confusion and change. The Vietnam War ended in heartbreak. The Watergate scandal shook faith in government. Yet science and culture flourished. Men had already walked on the moon. Music turned from protest to reflection. Technology began to hum quietly in the background. Computers, networks, whispers of a digital future. By the 1980s and 90s, America was a global power, rich, creative, restless. Movies, music, and machines shaped the world's imagination. But new challenges emerged: poverty, inequality, and a planet showing signs of pain. And then, in 2001, a morning changed everything. September 11, a day when towers fell and hearts broke. The War on Terror began, and America once again found itself at war, not with a nation, but with fear itself. The 21st century brought technology beyond imagination. Phones became worlds. Voices traveled through air and light. But along with progress came loneliness, division, and noise. America faced recessions, pandemics, protests, and political storms. It remained powerful, yet wounded, proud, yet uncertain. And still, through all the noise, the same heartbeat remained, the belief that tomorrow can be better. Because that is the secret of America, not perfection, but persistence, not glory, but the quiet courage to keep trying. From the first footsteps on untouched soil to the steel cities that kiss the clouds, from the songs of the native tribes to the voices that dream of justice, the story of America is not one of heroes and villains. It is one of people, flawed, hopeful, and human. A land forever searching for its soul. A nation built not just on freedom, but on the promise to become better. And so the history of the United States continues, a story still being written in every dream, in every struggle, and in every heartbeat that dares to believe in tomorrow.